In Rome, during the mid-1st century, AD history's most unusual athletic event was underway. In one corner, the city's most accomplished Lady of the Evening, a true professional in her field. Her challenger, none other than the Empress of the Roman Empire. The contest was a marathon of, well, you know. The goal was to see who could service the most clients before dawn. According to the ancient historians, the Empress didn't just compete, she won. Our subject is Empress Valeria Messalina, wife to the Emperor Claudius. To history, her name isn't just synonymous with power, it's synonymous with a kind of enthusiasm. That would make a sailor blush. But is any of this true? Did the most powerful woman in the world really sneak out at night to work in a common brothel for fun? Or was this story the single most brilliant and vicious political smear job of all time? It turns out in the deadly game of Roman politics, your bedroom habits weren't the real scandal. Your ambition was. Welcome to Cursed Chambers, where we find that a woman's reputation is often the first casualty in a man's war for power. To understand how an empress's private life could become a matter of state security, you first have to understand the city she lived in. Rome in the year 41 AD wasn't just a city. It was the entire world in miniature, a sprawling, chaotic marble and mud metropolis that was simultaneously the most magnificent and most disgusting place on earth. Down in the valleys, you had the Subura, a maze of winding alleys and rickety 5-story apartment blocks called insules, which had a nasty habit of collapsing or catching fire. This was the Rome of the common man, loud, smelly, and dangerously overcrowded. A world of street food stalls, public latrines, and 1,000 different languages mingling in the air. But then you look up. Looming over it all was the Palatine Hill. This was another planet entirely, a world of shimmering marble palaces, manicured gardens, and private libraries. This was the home of the Caesars, the nerve center of an empire that stretched from the cold mists of Britain to the hot sands of Egypt. Our story takes place here on the Palatine, where the air was cleaner, the wine was older, and the political games were infinitely more deadly. It was a gilded cage, and its inhabitants were about to be plunged into a crisis that would expose the rotten foundations on which their entire world was built. To understand what happens next, you need to understand the rules of the game. And in Julio-Claudian Rome, the rules were simple. There were no rules. Think of the Roman Empire less as a government and more as a family business, a deeply dysfunctional, staggeringly wealthy, and homicidally paranoid family business, where the CEO had absolute power and the board members were constantly plotting to kill him. For the past 80 years, this business had been run by one family, the Julio-Claudians. First, you had the founder Augustus, a political genius who disguised a military dictatorship as a restored republic. Then came his successor Tiberius, a gloomy and suspicious ruler who ran the empire from a secluded island villa, while his henchmen in Rome conducted brutal treason trials. And then you got Caligula. Caligula took the imperial paranoia and cranked it up to 11, with a healthy dose of what can only be described as barking madness. He was the boss who promotes his horse to a senior management position just to show everyone who's in charge. He was so universally despised that in January of 41 AD, his own bodyguards, the Praetorian Guard, finally had enough. They cornered him in a palace corridor and stabbed him to death. This created a power vacuum. With Caligula dead and no clear successor named, the Roman state technically ceased to exist. For a few frantic hours, the Senate debated restoring the old republic, but it was too late. The Praetorian Guard, the very men who had just murdered one emperor, decided they rather liked having an emperor to guard. It was, after all, a very secure and well-paying job, so they went looking for a new one. And this brings us to our first key player, the man who by all logic should have been dead a dozen times over. Meet Claudius. At the moment, his nephew Caligula was being turned into a human pincushion. 50-year-old Claudius was, according to our sources, hiding behind a curtain in the palace, fearing for his life. He was Caligula's uncle, the last adult male of the direct family line. To the assassins, he was just another loose end to be tied up. But when a guardsman pulled back the curtain and found him cowering there, a strange thing happened. Instead of killing him, the soldier recognized him. And in a moment of inspired opportunism, he and his comrades hoisted the terrified Claudius onto their shoulders, marched him to their camp, and proclaimed him the new emperor of Rome. The Senate, faced with an armed and expectant military, had no choice but to agree. It was one of the most absurd ascensions to power in history, the walking definition of failing upwards. You see, Claudius had spent his entire life being seen as a complete non-entity. He was afflicted with a stammer, a limp, and various nervous tics. His own mother reportedly called him a monstrosity of a human being, one that nature began and never finished. He was kept out of public life, a family embarrassment to be hidden away. But this obscurity was his salvation. While others schemed, fought, and were executed, Claudius was ignored. He spent his days quietly as a scholar and a historian. He wasn't a threat, so he was allowed to live. And as a result, when the dust settled, he was the only one left standing. The problem was, this bookish, awkward academic now had to rule an empire. He was intelligent, yes, but he was also politically naive, easily manipulated, and deeply insecure. He was a man who trusted few, and for good reason. He needed allies. He needed an administration. And most of all, he needed to secure the future of the dynasty. He needed a wife, and he needed an heir. And that brings us to the woman at the center of our storm, Valeria Messalina. She was everything Claudius was not: young, vibrant, and famously beautiful. She was a blue-blooded aristocrat descended from the sister of the great Augustus himself. She had been married to the much older Claudius before he became emperor, a political match made when he was still just the family weirdo. Now suddenly, at the age of perhaps 19 or 20, she was the empress. Her job in the brutal calculus of Roman politics was singular: to produce a male heir and secure the bloodline. And in this, she was ruthlessly efficient. She quickly gave Claudius 2 children, a daughter Octavia, and most importantly, a son and heir named Britannicus. On the surface, she was the perfect empress, the symbol of Roman female virtue, or pudicitia. Chaste, loyal, dedicated to her husband and children. Her image was on coins, her statues in the forum. She was the living embodiment of the stability and fertility of the new regime. But this public image was a mask. Messalina was a player who understood the game. She had grown up in the venomous court of Caligula. She knew that power was the only real security, and that enemies had to be eliminated before they eliminated you. She was young, she was ambitious, and she was positioned right at the ear of the most powerful man in the world. She was the ultimate imperial trophy wife. But the trophy was starting to think for itself, and in Rome, a thinking woman with power was the most dangerous thing of all. This brings us to our final group of players. They had no famous family names, no statues in the forum, but in many ways they were more powerful than the empress herself. Meet the backroom boys, the imperial freedmen. In one of his most radical moves, Claudius bypassed the traditional snobbish senatorial aristocracy for his administration. Instead, he relied on a small clique of his most trusted servantsmen who were technically former slaves. His private secretaries Narcissus and Pallas, and his treasurer Callistus. To the old Roman nobility, this was an absolute scandal. It was like finding out a modern superpower was being run not by a cabinet of elected officials, but by the president's personal assistant, his butler, and his accountant. But to Claudius, it made perfect sense. These men were loyal only to him, not to their own ancient families. They were incredibly competent, and because of their origins, they could never be emperor themselves. They were the perfect civil service. They were also fabulously wealthy and utterly ruthless. They controlled access to the emperor. They drafted his letters, managed his finances, and whispered advice in his ear. They were the true gatekeepers of power, and they saw the young, ambitious empress not as a partner, but as a rival for influence over their insecure and easily swayed master. So the stage is set. You have an aging, insecure emperor, a man who stumbled into power and is terrified of losing it. You have a young, beautiful, and politically savvy empress determined to secure power for herself and her son. And you have a shadowy cabal of ex-slaves who are actually running the day-to-day business of the empire and who will destroy anyone who threatens their position. A silent war was brewing in the marble halls of the Palatine. A war for the soul of the emperor. A war between his wife and his staff. Something had to give. And according to the story that has come down to us, what gave was Messalina's morality. And it gave in the most spectacular way imaginable. So we have our players and our stage. An insecure emperor, his ambitious young wife, and a cabinet of powerful ex-slaves who hate her. For the first few years of Claudius's reign, this fragile balance held. But Messalina was not the type to sit quietly and wait for things to happen. She knew she was one bad illness or one political misstep away from being a widow. And in Rome, a widowed empress with a young son was not a position of power. It was a target. She decided to play offense. And so begins the first chapter of her downfall, a chapter that has nothing to do with recreational activities and everything to do with cold, hard politics. Messalina's first order of business was to eliminate any conceivable threat to her son Britannicus's future claim to the throne. Her methods were brutally efficient and followed a simple, repeatable formula: accuse, exile, execute. Her first major target was Julia Livilla, her husband's own niece and the sister of the late unlamented Caligula. Julia was a direct descendant of Augustus and had a strong claim to influence. So what did Messalina do? She accused Julia of adultery with the famous philosopher Seneca. Now in Roman politics, adultery was a wonderfully flexible charge. It could mean anything from they were discovered performing the horizontal folk dance to he has a very nice villa and I want it. In this case, it was almost certainly the latter. There was no trial, no real evidence presented. On Messalina's word alone, Claudius had his niece exiled to a barren island where she was later starved to death. Seneca, the great Stoic philosopher, was also exiled, only allowed back to Rome years later to become the tutor to another promising young man, Nero. A decision that would ironically come back to haunt Messalina's children. This was just the beginning. The purge continued. One powerful senator, Valerius Asiaticus, was next. The official charge was treason. The unofficial story, Messalina simply wanted his spectacular gardens, the gardens of Lucullus, which were among the most beautiful in Rome. Asiaticus was forced to take his own life. The gardens became Messalina's property. One by one, those who were too powerful, too popular, or simply in her way were cut down. She wasn't just an empress. She was a political operator using her influence over Claudius to build her own power base and fill her own coffers. She was creating a network of allies who owed their careers and their fortunes to her. At this point, a sensible person might have laid low for a while, cashed in their winnings, and enjoyed their new real estate. But Messalina, as we are establishing, did not do laying low. She did doubling down. And as her political power grew, so too did the stories about her personal life. Stories that were far more scandalous and far more useful to her enemies. We now move from the public record of executions and into the murky world of rumor. This is where history gets spicy. Because as Messalina's enemies, particularly the freedmen, Narcissus and Pallas, watched her influence grow, they knew they couldn't attack her politically. She had the emperor's ear, so they allegedly began to attack her where a powerful woman was most vulnerable, her reputation. The stories started to circulate. At first, they were plausible. Whispers of an affair with a handsome actor named Mnestor. The story goes that Mnestor, fearing for his life, initially refused her advances. Messalina, infuriated, complained to Claudius that the actor was refusing to obey her command. Claudius, completely unaware of the context, summoned Mnestor and ordered him to obey the empress in all things. The actor, now armed with a direct imperial command, dutifully went and did, well, exactly what he was told. The story of True is a perfect illustration of both Messalina's audacity and Claudius's spectacular cluelessness. But the stories didn't stop there. They grew more and more elaborate. It was said she had a secret room built in the palace just for her, private appointments, a place where senators and aristocrats would be invited to perform their patriotic duty to the empress. And then comes the most infamous tale of all, the story that cemented her reputation for 2,000 years. The ancient sources, particularly the satirist Juvenal, paint an incredible picture. They claim that Messalina would wait until her husband, the Emperor of Rome, was asleep. Then, this mother and symbol of Roman virtue would put on a cheap cloak and a blonde wig, the trademark of a streetwalker, and sneak out of the palace. Accompanied by a single maid, she would make her way to a grimy brothel in the Subura. There, under the pseudonym Lysiska, meaning the she-wolf, she would take up a vacant booth and service any man who came through the door all night long. The story culminates in a legendary contest. Messalina supposedly challenged the brothel's most accomplished and tireless professional, a woman named Scylla, to a competition. The goal was to see who could accumulate the most billable hours in a single night. According to Juvenal, even after Scylla gave up, exhausted Messalina continued on, only returning to the palace at dawn, bringing back to the imperial pillow the scent of the brothel. Now we have to ask ourselves, is this history, or is this the plot of a particularly racy Roman soap opera? The stories became so wild, so specific, that they feel less like a leak from the palace and more like a creative writing project sponsored by her political rivals. Yet this was the image being crafted, an empress so consumed by her appetites that she was not just immoral, but dangerously out of control. And it was all building towards one final catastrophic act. By the year 48 AD, Messalina had been empress for 7 years. Her son Britannicus was 7 years old, and Claudius was 57, an old man by Roman standards. She must have known that her power, her wealth, her very life was tied directly to her aging, insecure husband. If he died, she would be at the mercy of a new emperor, or worse, the political rivals she had spent years making. She decided to make her final, most audacious move. Her target this time was not an enemy to be eliminated, but a partner to be acquired. His name was Gaius Silius. Silius was, by all accounts, the total package. He was young, intelligent, a designated consul for the next year, and reputedly the most handsome man in Rome. Messalina fell for him, or at least for what he represented. She began a public brazen affair with him. It was an open secret in Rome. She showered him with gifts and political favors, stripping other nobles' homes of their heirlooms to decorate his mansion. She even forced him to divorce his own well-respected wife. This was already pushing the limits of imperial scandal, but Messalina was about to vault right over them. In the autumn of 48 AD, Claudius traveled to the port city of Ostia, a few miles outside Rome, to preside over a religious festival. He was gone, the city was hers, and she used the opportunity to do the unthinkable. She married Gaius Silius. This wasn't some secret romantic elopement. It was a full public wedding ceremony held in the heart of Rome. There were witnesses, a dowry was paid, a formal marriage contract was signed. It was followed by a wild, drunken harvest festival party at Silius's new home, where the Empress of Rome was seen carousing with her new husband, her hair unbound. This was it, the final spectacular act of defiance. This wasn't an affair anymore. This wasn't a rumor about a brothel. This was bigamy. This was treason, gift-wrapped and delivered to the front door of the palace while the master of the house was away. Her enemies, the freedmen, finally had what they needed. This wasn't a rumor they had to spread. This was a public fact they could report. The only question that has echoed for 2,000 years is, why would she do something so reckless, so public, so guaranteed to end in her own destruction? Was she simply a fool, blinded by love for the most handsome man in Rome? Was she a depraved thrill-seeker who had finally gone too far? Or was this something else entirely? Was this the most audacious political gamble in Roman history? That is the question we now have to investigate. All right, the story is over. The curtain has fallen on our Roman tragedy, the bodies have been cleared from the stage, and the freedman Narcissus is probably counting his money. Now comes the good part, the part where we stop being storytellers and become historical detectives. Let's open the case file. The official charge that got Messalina killed was treason, specifically for her illegal marriage to Gaius Silius. But that's not the crime she was convicted of in the court of history. For 2,000 years, her real sentence has been for a different charge, entirely monstrous, uncontrollable, over-enthusiasm. The official story, the one you read in the ancient books, is simple and satisfying. Messalina was a bad seed, a nymphomaniac, a woman so enslaved by her appetites that she flew too close to the sun and got burned. Her downfall was an inevitability, a moral lesson about the wages of sin. It's neat, it's tidy, and it's a brilliant piece of propaganda. But we're in the cursed chamber. We don't do neat and tidy. Let's look at the evidence. Exhibit of the witnesses. First, let's consider the sources for this spectacular story. Our main witnesses for the prosecution are the historians Tacitus and Suetonius and the poet Juvenal. On the surface, they're credible. But when you look closer, their testimony starts to fall apart. First, the timeline. None of these men were eyewitnesses. They were all writing between 50 and 80 years after Messalina was dead. Their information was secondhand, based on court gossip, political pamphlets, and the memories of old men who had survived a deeply paranoid era. This isn't breaking news, it's history written from hearsay. Second, their bias. Tacitus and Suetonius were members of the senatorial class. They were old money aristocrats who despised the imperial system that had stripped their class of its power. They especially hated emperors like Claudius, who relied on upstart freedmen instead of the nobility. And they had a deep, profound suspicion of any woman who wielded political power. To them, a woman in politics was unnatural, a sign of corruption and decay. Livia Agrippina Messalina. They were all villains in his story. And Juvenal, he was a satirist. His job wasn't to report facts, it was to write biting, exaggerated social commentary. Using Juvenal to understand Messalina's actual life is like trying to understand 21st century politics by only reading memes. It might capture a certain feeling, but it's not the literal truth. So our star witnesses are a group of politically biased, misogynistic men writing decades after the fact, based on gossip. This isn't a solid foundation for a murder conviction, let alone a 2 millennia-long character assassination. Exhibit B, the motive. Now let's re-examine Messalina's alleged crimes, but this time let's look at them not as acts of lust, but as acts of political calculation. The official story says she destroyed her rivals out of jealousy and greed, but look at who she targeted: Julia Livilla, a woman with a legitimate blood claim; Valerius Asiaticus, a rich and powerful senator who was twice consul. These weren't romantic rivals, they were political threats. Male emperors purged their rivals all the time. When Augustus or Tiberius did it, it was called consolidating power. When Messalina did it, it was called being a greedy, jealous woman. And what about her infamous networking? The story goes that she forced men into her bed for her own pleasure. But in a world where women were barred from holding office, what other tools did she have? The bedroom was an extension of the Senate floor. It was a place to forge alliances, demand loyalty, and gather information. We call it an orgy. She might have called it a very productive staff meeting. Her affairs, if they happened on the scale, we're told weren't just about pleasure. They were about building a faction loyal to her and her son, in direct opposition to the freedmen loyal to Claudius. Everything she did, from exiling rivals to entertaining allies, points not to a woman out of control, but to one who was trying desperately to control her own destiny in the only way she knew how. Exhibit C, the wedding. This brings us to the final act, the marriage to Gaius Silius. The official story frames this as the ultimate act of a love-struck fool. A woman so blinded by her passion for the handsomest man in Rome that she threw away everything. It's a romantic, tragic narrative. It's also almost certainly nonsense. Let's look at it from a different angle. This wasn't an act of passion. It was an attempted coup d'etat. Consider the facts. Claudius was 57. He was frequently ill. His health was a constant source of anxiety. If he died suddenly, Messalina, as the mother of the 7-year-old heir, would be in mortal danger. She needed a protector, an ally who could secure her son's position. Enter Gaius Silius. He wasn't just a pretty face. He was consul designate, a powerful political figure. The plan was likely not to replace Claudius, but to sideline him. The public wedding was a power play designed to force Claudius's hand. The goal was probably to have Claudius either adopt Silius as his son and co-ruler, or to force him to abdicate in favor of Britannicus, with Silius and Messalina acting as regents. It was an incredibly high-stakes gamble, a desperate, audacious move to seize control of the succession before it was too late. It was a political Hail Mary. And it failed spectacularly, not because it was illogical, but because her enemies, the freedmen, got to Claudius first. They didn't just tell him his wife was having an affair. They told him Silius was already on the throne, that the army had sworn allegiance to him, and that Claudius was about to be murdered. They panicked him into action. So we come to the truth at the heart of the mystery. The curse of Messalina was not her libido. The cursed chamber she inhabited was not a secret room in the palace or a booth in a brothel. It was the suffocating patriarchal structure of Roman political power. The real story of Messalina is not about sex, it's about ambition. Her crime wasn't adultery, it was attempting to wield direct political power in a world run by men. This was so terrifying, so unnatural to the Roman elite, that they couldn't simply label her a political rival. They had to pathologize her. They had to reframe her ambition as a sickness, a monstrous sexual deviancy that threatened the natural order of things. Her lust wasn't for the flesh, it was for power, the one thing a Roman woman was told she could never have. The nymphomaniac Empress was a character assassination, a convenient and brilliantly effective fiction created to justify the execution of a political threat and to serve as a warning to any other woman who might dare to try the same thing. The story of her life was rewritten by the men who defeated her. And as we'll see in our final chapter, the consequences of her fall and the lesson her successor learned from it would plunge Rome into even darker times. So after wading through 2 millennia of slander propaganda and political maneuvering, what is our final verdict on Empress Valeria Messalina? The woman condemned by history as a ravenous nymphomaniac was in all likelihood nothing of the sort. The evidence points not to a sex-crazed monster, but to a ruthless, intelligent, and ambitious political operator who was playing a deadly game she was ultimately destined to lose. She was almost certainly no saint. Her hands were stained by the political purges she orchestrated, but the wild tales of her nightly, extracurricular adventures were almost certainly a fiction, a weaponized rumor, a cloud of character assassination designed to mask a political execution. She wasn't brought down by her appetites, but by her ambition. In the end, she made a desperate gamble to secure her son's future and lost. But the consequences of her fall and the power vacuum she left behind would have a ripple effect that would drown her legacy, her children, and eventually Rome itself in a new wave of terror. The story doesn't end with her death. In many ways, that's where the real tragedy begins. With Messalina gone, Emperor Claudius, the most powerful man in the world, was suddenly single again. The position of empress was open, and a new competition began. This time, the prize wasn't just a place in the emperor's bed, but control of the empire itself. The victor was a woman who had watched Messalina's rise and fall very, very carefully. In fact, she had been one of the few to survive Messalina's purges. Her name was Agrippina the Younger. She was Messalina's niece Caligula's sister, and a woman who made Messalina's political maneuvering look like amateur hour. Agrippina had learned a crucial lesson from her predecessor's failure. Messalina had been too brazen, too public, too reckless. Agrippina would be patient, cunning, and methodical. Where Messalina used raw influence, Agrippina used seduction and legal manipulation. She also had one major advantage: she was Claudius's niece. She seduced her own uncle, persuading the aging and lonely emperor to marry her. This was technically incest under Roman law, but laws are merely suggestions when you're the emperor. They simply had a new one passed to make it legal. With the marriage secure, Agrippina began her master plan. She had one goal: to see her own son from a previous marriage, a young man named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, placed on the throne. First, she recalled the philosopher Seneca from the exile Messalina had sent him to, his new job to be her son's personal tutor, shaping him into a future ruler. Then she systematically persuaded Claudius to adopt her son, giving him a new, more famous name, Nero. This was the checkmate move. Nero was now the older brother to Messalina's son, Britannicus. in the Roman mind that put him first in line for the succession. Agrippina had effectively disinherited the very boy Messalina had died trying to protect. The final act came in the year 54 AD. Claudius, having served his purpose conveniently, died after eating a dish of mushrooms, which Agrippina may or may not have personally seasoned with a little something extra. Before anyone could rally around the true heir, Britannicus, Agrippina presented her son Nero to the Praetorian Guard as the new Emperor of Rome. A few months later, at a dinner party in the palace, 13-year-old Britannicus suddenly collapsed in agony and died. The official cause was epilepsy. The real cause was almost certainly a fast-acting poison administered on the orders of his new stepbrother, Emperor Nero. Messalina's bloodline had been extinguished. Her son was dead. Her daughter Octavia would later be murdered by Nero as well. Her entire political project, her life's work, had been completely and utterly erased. Her successor had not only taken her crown, but had also ensured her memory would be buried under a mountain of scandal, while her own son became a god. And here lies the ultimate bitter irony. The Roman elite, the men who wrote the histories, clutched their pearls and condemned Messalina for her supposed sexual deviancy, painting her as a moral stain on the fabric of the empire. Yet they had just handed absolute power to a man, Nero, whose own personal life would make Messalina's alleged antics look like a church picnic. Well, this was a man who would murder his own mother, Agrippina, the woman who put him on the throne, and his romantic proclivities would set a new imperial standard for creative partnerships. This included a public wedding ceremony to another man, Sporus, a freedman who was surgically altered to resemble Nero's late wife, Poppaea, whom he had kicked to death. It seems Roman morality was remarkably flexible. For a woman, ambition was a sexual perversion punishable by death. For a male emperor, literally anything was on the table. So what is the final human insight we take from the cursed chamber of Messalina? It's a chillingly modern one. Her story is a timeless, brutal lesson in the nature of a very specific political weapon, the sexual smear. It's a tactic as old as Rome itself. When you cannot defeat a powerful woman on the grounds of her competence, her intelligence, or her policies, you attack her on the grounds of her character. You paint her as emotional unstable, and most effectively, as sexually deviant. You transform her ambition into a pathology. You can't let her be a rival. You have to make her a monster, because monsters are easier to destroy. The ultimate tragedy of Messalina is not that she died, but that her enemies were so successful in rewriting her life. She is not remembered as the shrewd political operator she was, but as the one-dimensional caricature they created. Her story serves as a powerful reminder that history is rarely a clear, clean narrative. It is a messy, bloody, and often deeply unsatisfying story written by the victors. And for 2,000 years, they have made sure we only ever heard their side. What do you think? Was Messalina a victim of history or a villain who got what she deserved? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to unlock more of history's cursed chambers, be sure to subscribe. The past is waiting.